Hi guys, welcome back to my channel and welcome to today's tutorial video. In today's video I'm going to show you how you can use a solvent to get a really nice smooth blend with your coloured pencils. If you want to achieve a really smooth, almost painterly effect and get rid of all of that grain that often shows through when you are blending or burnishing coloured pencils, then this is going to be the tutorial for you. So I'm going to show you what you should and what you shouldn't do when you use solvent for blending your pencils. I'm also going to show you 2 additional tools that you can use with a solvent to get a really nice smooth blend. So make sure that you carry on watching until the end to see those. So let's get straight into today's tutorial. So I'm going to start off and explain exactly what a solvent is and how it is useful for coloured pencils. So a solvent is basically something which dissolves another thing. So a solvent, in the case that we're using it, is going to dissolve your coloured pencils, but it's not going to dissolve them so they go away completely. All it does is dissolve the binder, and it moves the pigment around enough so that you can get it into the tooth of the paper. So it eliminates that grain and that white substance which often shows through with coloured pencil work. So when it comes to choosing your solvent, there are loads that you can actually choose from, but some of the best are Mona Lisa odorless mineral spirits, you have Gamsol, and you have Zest-It, and those are some of the best in my opinion that you can use for your coloured pencil work. When you come to using a solvent, you always need to make sure that you are working in a ventilated room, so make sure that all of your doors and windows are open, because if you breathe in the fumes that a solvent gives off, it can affect your head, it can give you a headache, it can also make you feel quite sick as well. So you need to make sure that if you are using a solvent that you work in a ventilated room to prevent that from happening. You also need to make sure that you try not to eat or drink when you're using a solvent, because if some gets on your hands and then you're eating or drinking, you're going to transfer that to yourself, and some solvents can be extremely harmful. So just make sure that you keep your room ventilated and that you try and limit what you eat and drink whilst you are using your solvent with your artwork. So the solvent which I like to use is Zest-It, and I like to use this one because I found that it affects me the least. So when I'm using it, it doesn't give me a headache, it doesn't make me feel dizzy, it doesn't make me feel sick or anything like that. So I like to use Zest-It, and I also like to use it because it has a really nice citrus smell. It doesn't smell really chemically like some of the other solvents. It smells really nice when you're using it, which is a plus for me. So if you want to see more about how Zest-It works and a better explanation of Zest-It as a product, then I have done a review of that, and I will leave a link up above and in the description for you if you want to go and check that out. So before you put down any solvent on your coloured pencil work, you need to make sure that you have built up enough coloured pencil layers. So even though you're using a solvent to blend, you still need to use a lot of layers with your coloured pencil work. And you need to put down a lot of layers before you start blending, otherwise the blender is not going to have anything to actually blend. So you need to make sure that you have enough layers to begin with. And I like to make sure that I have at least 5 layers of coloured pencil down before I actually start working. And with these coloured pencil layers, I work them in exactly the same way as if I wasn't using a solvent. So I make sure that I use really light pressure, I use a really sharp pencil to get a really nice smooth, even layer of colour, and I make sure that I actually build the layers in exactly the same way as if I wasn't using that solvent. So when it comes to doing your very first layer of solvent, this is when a majority of the blending is done, the initial blending of those base layers on your coloured pencil work. So you need to make sure that your brush isn't too wet and your brush isn't too dry. And this is the time that you need to use the most solvent on your brush to blend your coloured pencil work. So the best way to do this is to dip your paintbrush into your solvent, whether that's directly in the bottle or if you're putting it in a little container. Directly dip your paintbrush into the solvent and wipe off the excess on the side of the bottle or the container. And then what I like to do is just have a spare piece of kitchen towel or toilet paper or something that I can dab the excess solvent onto. And the key here is to have not a really dry brush but not a really wet brush, somewhere in between. So you want your bristles of your brush to kind of stick together. So you don't want to see any sort of drips coming off of your paintbrush once you've dabbed. You just want it to lightly glisten with the solvent and just hold the bristles together ever so slightly. So once you have got that perfect amount of solvent on your brush, then it's time to blend on your coloured pencil work. And the way that I like to do this is to use really small circular motions to blend the coloured pencil out. So I just use the brush in small circular motions going round and round just to dissolve that binder and move that pigment around right into the tooth of the paper there. You also need to make sure that you don't work on an area too much, because you will move that pigment around too much and you'll create sort of bald spots within your coloured pencil work. So you need to just work quite quickly around your area and try not to overwork certain areas. So now that I have explained what to do, how wet to have your brush and what motion to use when you are blending with your solvent, now I'm going to show you what you shouldn't be doing with your solvent. So one of the most common mistakes that people make when they are using a solvent is using too much on their brush. So they are physically loading their brush so it is dripping wet and then applying that to their coloured pencil work. And all that is going to do is just saturate your paper, and it's going to move the pigment around too much, and you're going to create these bald spots within your coloured pencil work. And that is something that you want to avoid at all costs. Another common mistake that people make is using too little solvent on their brush. And you want to avoid this as well, because this is a stage when you want to be using the most solvent, and then as you gradually add more coloured pencil layers and more layers of solvent, you want to gradually get less and less. So you want to start with more and gradually get less. You don't want to start with less and then gradually increase the amount of solvent that you're blending with. You also want to avoid applying too much pressure to your paintbrush. When you apply too much pressure and actually splay the bristles of your brush, you're going to apply too much pressure, and again you're going to lift the pigment too much and move it around too much, and you're going to create these bald spots, and you're not going to get a really nice smooth even blend. So you want to apply a little bit of pressure and not too much, so that your bristles are actually splaying out. So now it's time to go back in with some more layers of coloured pencil. But before we do that, we need to make sure that our solvent has actually dried. So before you go in and add more layers of coloured pencil, you need to set aside your drawing and make sure that it dries. And I would suggest 10 to 15 minutes would be enough for most solvents if you're not using too much. If you do use too much and you find that your paper is actually saturated on the back, then you need to leave your drawing for a little bit longer just so that it dries thoroughly. And you need to make sure that it dries, because if you work coloured pencil back over when it's wet, it's not going to apply in a smooth, even way. So you need to make sure that you allow your solvent to dry before you go in and add more layers of coloured pencil. So when you do go back in and add some more layers with your coloured pencil, you're going to find that it is really easy to add those coloured pencil layers back over the top. And that's because that solvent has broken down that binder, it's moved that pigment around into the tooth of the paper, and you've sort of almost regained that tooth, and it's like adding coloured pencil to a plain sheet of paper. But in actual fact, you have added layers and then you've blended. But your coloured pencil layers after you've blended are going to go down really, really easily. You're going to be able to apply loads of layers by using this method. So when you're applying your next layers of coloured pencil, you want to use them in exactly the same way as if you would an ordinary drawing. You want to make sure that your pencil's nice and sharp. You want to use really light pressure and slowly build those layers. And you want to make sure that you have nice, smooth, even, consistent colour across your layers. So once you've applied your second layer of coloured pencil layers after that initial blending period, then it's time to blend out again. So when it comes to blending after you've done the initial first layer of solvent blending, you want to use less on your brush. So you want to make sure that you blot a little bit more off of your brush when you're blending in this layer. So as I said previously, you want to use your first layer, that's when you want to use the most solvent on your brush, and then as you are blending in subsequent layers, you want to use less and less solvent on your brush. So when you're blending for the second time, you want to use less solvent on your brush than when you blended with the first time. When you're blending with subsequent layers of solvent, you want to make sure that you still use the same motion with your brush. So you want to just use really small circular motions to try and really get a really nice smooth blend, really get that pigment into the tooth of the paper. So you still want to use that small circular motion with your brush to enable a really nice smooth blend. And this is the same case if you are blending fur or any kind of feather or that kind of thing. You just want to use really small circular motions, and if necessary you can just stroke the paper in the direction that a fur is going in or something like that. But most of the time you want to use those small circular motions to get a really nice smooth blend. So now we have recapped what to do with subsequent layers. It's the same sort of thing as when you blend your first initial layer of solvent. Now I'm going to show you what you shouldn't be doing when blending your subsequent layers with a solvent. So what not to do is exactly the same as before. You want to make sure that you don't use too much. So you don't want to really load your brush with a load of solvent so that it's dripping wet and apply that to your coloured pencil work. You want to make sure that you have less solvent on your brush than you initially did for that first layer. So using too much solvent on your second layer of blending is going to move that pigment around even more, and it's going to create these bald patches, and it's just not going to be a really nice smooth and even blend. So you also want to make sure that you don't use too much pressure with your paintbrush once again. You don't want to really push down on your paintbrush and move that pigment around too much, because again it's just going to make it look really unsightly. You're not going to get that really nice smooth blend which you really want to aim for. So that is pretty much it with how to blend with a solvent. You just want to make sure that you use less and less solvent as you gradually increase your layers. So when it comes to doing your final layers, those sort of detail layers, you want to use as little solvent as possible. So you want to make sure that you have a really dry brush. And you want to make sure that you do that so that you don't move that pigment around, because the more layers of coloured pencil you have down, the more pigment you have on your paper. And of course, if you go in there with a really heavily loaded brush full of solvent and apply that to this masses of layers of pigment of coloured pencils, it's just going to move it around and it's going to make it look really ghastly and really unsightly, and you want to avoid that at all costs. So when it comes to blending out your detailed layers, those really final last few layers of coloured pencil, you want to make sure that your brush is as dry as possible. So you want to make sure that you hardly have any solvent on your brush, and you also want to make sure that you only blend in specific areas that you need to blend in, because if you're blending the whole area you risk moving that pigment around too much, and then you risk making it look really unsightly, and you just want to try and maintain that really nice smooth blend throughout. So now I've shown you how to blend with a solvent using a paintbrush, I'm going to show you two other materials that you can use with a solvent to get a really nice smooth blend. So the two materials that I'm going to be blending with is a blending stump or a tortillon or a paper stump, and also a cotton bud. And these are common household items, especially that cotton bud, and you can make your own paper stump if you don't have a paper stump to hand. So with these different materials, you would use them in exactly the same way as you did with the paintbrush. So with the blending stump, all you would do is just dip the blending stump into the solvent. You want to make sure that you don't dip it too far into the solvent though, because the paper stump is just going to absorb it. And if you dip it too far, then it's going to travel all the way up the paper stump. So you want to make sure that you just dip the very tip in, and the paper stump is going to absorb that solvent, and it's going to hold it a lot better as well for when you're blending. So when you're using the paper stump which is loaded with the solvent, you want to use it in exactly the same way as you would with a paintbrush. So you want to use really small circular motions to get a really nice smooth even blend. The great thing about using a paper stump is because it absorbs that solvent, you don't have to reapply it as much as you would if you was using a paintbrush. The only downside with using a paper stump is that it does pick up the pigment a lot easier than a paintbrush, so you still have to keep that scrap piece of paper or that piece of kitchen towel or that piece of toilet paper to the side to sort of wipe the excess pigment which the paper stump picks up. So you need to keep that to the side just to occasionally wipe your paper stump free of any of that pigment that it's picked up. So the second material is the cotton bud, and these are a really common household item and they give a really nice smooth blend as well. So again, you would use this in exactly the same way as you would the paintbrush. You would just dip it into your solvent, but the cotton bud you have to be careful because it does absorb a lot of the solvent. So similarly with the paintbrush, you have to make sure that you have that sort of blotting paper at your side to just blot off the excess solvent. So once you've blotted off that excess solvent on the cotton bud, you would use this in exactly the same way as you would the paintbrush. So you would use those really small circular motions using really light pressure just to dissolve the binder and move the pigment around on your paper. The great thing about the cotton bud, like the paper stump, is that it holds a lot of solvent, so you don't have to constantly reapply like you do with the paintbrush. The only downside with the cotton bud is that it does often hold too much solvent, so you really have to be careful that you're not applying too much solvent down because you will move that pigment around a little bit too much. So with the cotton bud you have to make sure that you do blot it enough before you actually apply it to your paper. So using these common household materials gives exactly the same results as working with the paintbrush. So if you don't have a paintbrush, but you do have cotton buds or you do have some paper around to make a paper stump, then go for those options because they give exactly the same blended results. So that's pretty much it for this tutorial, guys. I really hope that you have enjoyed this one. This is a really common question which I get asked, exactly how to use a solvent. So I hope this has cleared up a few issues for you of how you should be using a solvent to blend and how you shouldn't be using your solvent to blend. So really hope you have enjoyed this one and really found it useful. If you like this video, then make sure you give it a big thumbs up. And if you're new around here and you want to see more tutorials, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon as well, because I upload new tutorial videos every single Friday. There's art advice on Wednesdays and live streams every other Sunday. If you're looking for more of my content, then I have listed some really helpful videos just over there for you, so go and check those out. And I will see you in my next video. Bye!